December 1944. A bitter wind swept across the forests of Europe, carrying the stench of mud, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of blood. German prisoners of war trudged along narrow paths behind the Allied lines, their uniforms tattered, faces gaunt, and eyes hollow with the exhaustion of months spent on the losing side of a global conflict. They had endured retreat after retreat, fought battles that drained their spirits, and witnessed comrades vanish into the mud, never to return. And yet, nothing in their experience had prepared them for what they were about to see. In a small clearing behind the American lines, soldiers sat around makeshift tables, peeling back wrappers and biting into thick, rich chocolate bars. The sweet smell cut through the damp air, unnatural in its warmth, almost obscene in its comfort. The German men stopped in their tracks, disbelief etched across their faces. One leaned closer to another, whispering in disbelief, They have chocolate? Now? For months, even years, they had subsisted on meager rations of black bread, watery soups, and whatever scraps could be scavenged from bombed-out villages. The idea that a soldier could simply unwrap a candy bar, something that seemed frivolous in a world consumed by death and destruction, was alien. This was not just a small indulgence, it was a symbol of something far larger, a manifestation of an unseen power, America's industrial might. While Europe crumbled under the strains of blockade, shortages, and constant warfare, the United States had built a war machine capable not only of producing tanks, planes, and guns in staggering quantities, but of feeding every man who touched the front line. For the first time, the German prisoners saw that war was not just fought with bullets and steel, but with logistics, with the ability to ensure that every soldier remained fed, rested and ready to fight another day. The chocolate bar, ordinary to the American soldier, represented months of planning, innovation, and industrial coordination. Ingredients were sourced from across the Americas. Factories ran around the clock, and transportation networks moved supplies through ports and railways to reach even the most remote camps. In the face of this, the German army's struggles became starkly visible. While their soldiers scavenged and rationed, their enemies dined and replenished effortlessly. It was a quiet humiliation, delivered not with a gunshot, but with a bite of cocoa-rich chocolate, a sweetness that highlighted the bitter inadequacies of the Axis supply lines. Among the Americans, laughter and casual conversation flowed easily, a stark contrast to the tense, silent faces of the captured Germans. One young U.S. soldier unwrapped a second bar, smiling at the irony of his situation. He had left behind a small-town life, yet here, in the midst of the world's bloodiest conflict, he was offered a luxury his enemy could only dream of. The disparity was more than culinary, it was psychological. For the Germans, witnessing this abundance in the hands of those who could fight another day eroded more than morale. It planted seeds of doubt, of disbelief, and ultimately of fear. Yet this scene was just the beginning. The chocolate, the bread, the carefully preserved meat and canned goods were the visible tip of a vast logistical iceberg, one that would quietly turn the tide of battles without firing a single shot. America's ability to feed its soldiers, to sustain their energy, and to keep morale high would prove as decisive as any weapon. As the German POWs stared, silent and incredulous, a question formed in their minds. Heavy and unanswerable, how could one side be drowning in abundance while the other scraped by on crumbs? And in that question lay the hidden truth of the war, one that few would recognize until it was far too late. Winter, 1942. The Eastern Front stretched endlessly, a frozen expanse of mud, snow, and shattered villages. German soldiers huddled in foxholes, their breath visible in the icy air, fingers stiff and numb. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at their bellies, a constant companion to the fear of Soviet counterattacks. Rations were thin, often little more than black bread, ersatz coffee, and watery soups made from whatever scraps could be scrounged. Meat was a luxury, warmth even rarer, and the bitter wind seemed to carry whispers of despair from one shattered unit to the next. In these desperate conditions, the concept of a chocolate bar was almost mythical. Soldiers remembered vaguely the days before the war, when small squares of sweet cocoa might have accompanied a cup of coffee or been gifted to children in the family home. By the winter of 1942, chocolate had largely vanished from the German soldiers' world. It survived only in rare packages reserved for officers or occasionally requisitioned from civilian stores, often taken forcibly as the front lines moved through towns. For the average infantryman, the taste of sweetness was something remembered, imagined, a ghost from a life that felt increasingly distant. Beyond the hunger itself, the lack of food was a psychological weapon, grinding down morale as effectively as artillery. Soldiers argued over scraps, scoured frozen fields for discarded roots or leftover rations, and sometimes plundered villages for canned goods. Yet these efforts were haphazard, unreliable, and often dangerous. The more the front stretched, the more precarious life became. Hunger was relentless, shaping decisions on the battlefield, weakening bodies and eroding the will to fight. Each day was a careful calculation: conserve energy, protect what little food remained, and hope the next supply train would arrive. Winter clothing and warmth were scarce as well. Boots froze to the mud, hands cracked with frostbite, and the meager fuel available for heating was often rationed to the point of absurdity. Soldiers learned to sleep huddled together, sharing body heat, and to make do with what little could be scavenged from destroyed enemy positions. The daily struggle was less about grand strategy and more about surviving until the next morning, a fight waged with stomachs as empty as hearts. Amid this desperation, chocolate became a symbol not just of luxury, but of a world out of reach, a world the German soldier could see but never touch. The small sweetness, once a casual indulgence, now represented abundance, comfort, and the promise of energy that could sustain a body through long, freezing days. Each missing ration, each absent meal, emphasized the contrast between scarcity and plenty, leaving soldiers to wonder whether the war could ever be won on an empty stomach. It was in this context that the German army's limitations became painfully clear. They could seize land, move armies, and conquer territory, but the infrastructure to sustain those armies over long campaigns was fragile, overstretched, and reliant on the very populations they occupied. Hunger was not incidental. It was systemic, a quiet force shaping the outcome of battles even before bullets were fired. And yet, across the Atlantic, a very different philosophy was taking shape. In America, soldiers were not meant to scrape by on scraps or scavenged rations. The belief was simple yet revolutionary. A well-fed soldier was a fighting soldier. Every calorie, every morsel, every carefully planned meal was a weapon in itself, an invisible edge that would shape the course of the war. In America, however, the philosophy of feeding the soldier was radically different. Summer 1943, across the rolling plains of the Midwest, massive warehouses hummed with activity, a symphony of forklifts, trucks, and the rhythmic shuffle of countless boots. This was not a battlefield, at least not in the traditional sense. There were no explosions, no shouts of soldiers charging into fire. Yet here, far from the front lines, the fate of millions of men, and the outcome of the war itself, was being quietly decided. This was the domain of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, an organization whose influence stretched from the factories of Detroit to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The Quartermaster Corps was tasked with a mission as simple to state as it was complex to execute: feed, clothe, and supply every soldier in the field. It was a responsibility that demanded foresight, ingenuity, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Unlike the German army, which often viewed food as a necessary inconvenience, the Americans treated logistics as a weapon, one capable of shaping battles before a single rifle was fired. Every ration was carefully calculated, every shipment meticulously tracked, and every factory coordinated with military precision. The soldier on the front line was only as strong as the system that supported him, and the quartermasters took this responsibility seriously. Factories churned out millions of rations each month, standardizing food not only for taste and nutrition, but for durability and ease of transport. Cans of meat, blocks of butter, powdered eggs, and hardtack biscuits moved like clockwork from production lines to depots to trucks and trains, ultimately arriving in the hands of soldiers ready to fight. The process was industrial choreography on a staggering scale. It was not enough to simply feed men. They had to be fed efficiently, reliably, and in forms that could withstand the rigors of a world at war. Innovation was central to this strategy. Engineers and nutritionists worked alongside logisticians to create meals that could survive months of storage and the harsh conditions of battlefields worldwide. They designed rations that were calorically dense, nutritionally balanced, and even, when possible, comforting to a soldier far from home. Each element was deliberate, a reminder that feeding an army was as much an art as it was science. And then there was morale, the invisible but vital ingredient. Soldiers could march through mud, endure cold, and face enemy fire, but the psychological edge of a well-fed body was undeniable. Hot meals could soothe nerves, chocolate could invigorate spirits, and even small luxuries became symbols of a nation's industrial and moral strength. The Quartermaster Corps understood that logistics was more than delivery. It was a statement of intent. Every crate, every box, every carefully wrapped ration was a silent message. We will sustain you. We will keep you strong. We will win. The Germans would never fully appreciate the scale or precision of this effort. To them, supply lines were fragile, overextended, and often improvised. To the Americans, supply was strategy. While bullets and bombs decided the fate of cities, it was the careful orchestration of meals, clothing, and tools that allowed soldiers to survive long enough to see victory. The Quartermaster Corps was the hidden backbone of the Allied war effort. The silent engine powering every maneuver, every offensive, every counterattack. And at the center of this strategy was a bar of chocolate, Philadelphia. 1943. The aroma of cocoa filled a factory unlike any the world had ever seen. Steam hissed from enormous kettles, conveyor belts clattered, and the hum of machinery mixed with the soft murmur of engineers and chocolatiers, all working under an unusual military directive. The U.S. Army had approached Hershey with a challenge: create a chocolate bar capable of sustaining soldiers in the harshest conditions, one that could survive heat, rough handling, and long storage, yet still deliver enough energy to keep a soldier moving. It was the birth of a new kind of weapon, edible, portable, and uniquely American. The requirements were simple to state, but devilishly complex to execute. The bar needed to be dense with calories, resistant to melting even in tropical heat, and tough enough to survive the jostling of trucks and backpacks. At the same time, it had to be unappealing enough that soldiers would not treat it as a treat to nibble casually. This was not candy meant to delight, but a tool of survival. Its mission was life itself, not pleasure. Hershey's engineers experimented with every ingredient, adjusting cocoa content, sugar ratios, and fats to achieve a product that balanced energy with durability. They discovered that by adding oat flour and powdered milk, they could increase caloric density while maintaining a texture that would hold together under extreme conditions. They tested prototypes in scorching warehouses and icy test chambers, observing how each bar fared under stress. The result was a chocolate bar unlike any that had come before, dark, bitter, and intentionally hard to eat. Soldiers would later call it the Hitler-proof chocolate, a tongue-in-cheek nod to its inedible appearance and persistence in the heat. But behind the humor was meticulous science. Every bar contained approximately 600 calories, enough to sustain a soldier for several hours in the field. Its bitterness was deliberate, a psychological measure to ensure that it was eaten only when necessary, not savored as a snack. The design reflected a deeper military philosophy. Food, like ammunition, was to be rationed carefully, consumed strategically, and respected for the power it bestowed. The D-ration bar also represented a profound collaboration between civilian industry and the military, a hallmark of the American war effort. Hershey's chocolate expertise met army specifications in a marriage of ingenuity and pragmatism. Engineers visited battlefronts to consult with soldiers, understanding the physical and mental demands of combat. Psychologists advised on taste and morale, ensuring that while the bar was bitter, it would still provide comfort in its own austere way. Every decision was intentional, every modification purposeful. Though designed for survival, the D-ration bar became a symbol of American ingenuity. It was a reminder that even in war, creativity could solve practical problems. That life-saving innovations did not always come in the form of tanks or planes, but sometimes in the form of a small, bitter square of chocolate. Soldiers learned to appreciate it in their own way, not for pleasure, but for the assurance that sustenance was always within reach, even when everything else seemed lost. And yet, this was only the beginning. While the D-ration bar could save a life in the moment, it did little to lift spirits or provide comfort. Soldiers, facing endless marches and grueling conditions, still yearned for a taste of sweetness, a reminder of home. A small pleasure that could break the monotony of war. It was called a survival ration, but something sweeter was coming. Autumn, 1943. Somewhere in the dense forests of Italy, American soldiers paused during a grueling march. Backpacks heavy with equipment, rifles slung over shoulders, faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion. They reached into their K-rations and pulled out small packages of candy, chewing gum, and instant coffee. To an outsider, it might have seemed trivial, even indulgent. Soldiers complaining about a meal of chocolate, biscuits, and a tiny tin of powdered meat. Yet in the context of war, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The K-ration, developed by the Army in collaboration with civilian food scientists, was designed for mobility and endurance. It was compact, lightweight, and calorie-rich, intended to sustain a soldier in combat situations where traditional mess halls or field kitchens were impossible. Each ration contained not just energy, but small luxuries, a square of chocolate, a piece of gum, and the aroma of instant coffee, which could lift weary spirits more effectively than any pep talk. While soldiers grumbled about its taste or repetitiveness, it represented a stark contrast to the bitter, monotonous rations of the German army. German POWs, watching from behind barbed wire, could hardly believe their eyes. These Americans, often under fire or on forced marches, were eating chocolate with casual ease. One prisoner, trying to conceal his envy, muttered to another, "They have sweets." In the middle of battle, the astonishment went beyond food. It was a glimpse into the extraordinary logistical machine sustaining the American military. While the German soldier scavenged, rationed, and sometimes went hungry, the American soldier carried a small piece of home in his pocket, a reminder that he was part of a nation capable of extraordinary coordination and care. The K-ration's chocolate bars were different from the bitter D-ration, though. They were sweeter, easier to eat, and designed to boost morale as much as physical energy. Soldiers learned to ration them carefully, hiding them in pockets for long marches, or sharing them with comrades as a small act of camaraderie. Chewing gum and instant coffee added a sensory connection to normal life, providing familiarity in an environment defined by chaos. Every bite, every sip was a psychological lifeline, reinforcing not just the body but the mind. Comparatively, the German soldiers' rations were stark and utilitarian. Black bread, watery soups, and occasional scraps offered nourishment but little comfort. Morale suffered as hunger persisted, shaping decisions on the battlefield and eroding endurance. The Americans, by contrast, understood that feeding their troops was as much about sustaining hope as sustaining bodies. Food became a tool of resilience, a subtle yet powerful way to ensure soldiers kept moving, kept fighting, and kept believing that they would survive another day. Even small indulgences mattered. A piece of chocolate in a foxhole, a sip of coffee under gunfire, or the simple act of sharing candy with a friend became rituals of survival. They reminded soldiers of what they were protecting, of the life beyond the battlefield, and of a nation committed to sustaining them at every level. It was a quiet but profound demonstration of the American philosophy of war. Fight with strength, yes, but also with comfort, care, and strategy. But food was more than calories. It was morale. Winter, 1944. Snow blanketed the war-torn streets of France, crunching softly under the boots of American soldiers as they moved from village to village, liberating towns scarred by years of conflict. In a small farmhouse repurposed as a temporary billet, soldiers huddled around a makeshift table, opening packages sent from home. Inside were letters, photos, and most treasured of all, chocolate bars, wrapped carefully in waxed paper. The smell alone brought a warmth that no fire could replicate, a reminder of kitchens far from the front lines, of family, of normalcy. Chocolate had become more than a simple ration. It had become a talisman, a psychological anchor in a world of chaos. Soldiers wrote home about it, describing the small delight of unwrapping a square after a long march, or sharing a bar with a comrade under the shadow of artillery fire. One young infantryman, writing to his mother, confessed that the chocolate reminded him of Sunday afternoons back home, of his mother's kitchen and the smell of cocoa drifting through the house. In the midst of battle, a taste of home provided a fleeting sense of security, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Care packages from civilians reinforced this bond. Women, men, and children across the United States folded letters into boxes filled with cookies, chocolate, and small comforts. Soldiers treasured these parcels, sometimes hiding the treats to ration out over weeks, sharing a bar with a weary comrade, or slipping a piece to a child in a recently liberated town. The chocolate became a currency of humanity, a way to connect across cultures and continents, to assert life and hope amidst the devastation. Even the distribution of chocolate among allies carried symbolic weight. British and Canadian soldiers received portions alongside American troops, sharing not only calories but camaraderie. It was a small, sweet gesture that reinforced unity, trust, and morale across multinational forces. In liberated towns, chocolate was offered to children, a moment of normalcy in a shattered world, a reminder that even war could not entirely erase innocence and joy. The psychological impact was as significant as the nutritional one. Soldiers who carried chocolate reported subtle boosts in energy and focus, but more importantly, it bolstered their mental resilience. A quick bite could calm nerves before an operation, offer comfort during a restless night, or provide a fleeting sense of indulgence when the world seemed devoid of kindness. Chocolate became a language of care, a silent affirmation that someone, somewhere, was looking out for them, ensuring their survival in every sense of the word. In letters, journals, and memoirs, chocolate is often mentioned not as a trivial indulgence, but as a cornerstone of morale. Soldiers knew that it was not just sugar and cocoa. They knew it represented a nation's commitment, a promise that they would be sustained, supported, and remembered. Every bar carried the weight of home, the reassurance of safety, and the invisible strength of logistics and planning. Meanwhile, Germany's morale was being starved away. Spring, 1944. Across the shattered cities of Germany, smoke still curled from bombed factories, and ration lines snaked endlessly through the streets. Soldiers and civilians alike moved with the weary resignation of a population stretched beyond endurance. The German war machine, once formidable and feared, now groaned under the strain of constant Allied bombing, fuel shortages, and the impossibility of sustaining an army across multiple fronts. Food, once a simple provision, had become a daily struggle, a symbol of systemic collapse. Rations for frontline soldiers had grown dangerously thin. Ersatz coffee, a bitter substitute made from roasted acorns or chicory, replaced the robust beans of peacetime. Soups were watery, made from whatever vegetables could be spared or scavenged, and meat was a rarity, reserved for officers or consumed through requisition from occupied towns. Bread, once hearty and sustaining, was stretched with fillers, potato flour, sawdust, or other extenders, turning it into a grey, tasteless staple that barely nourished. Hunger gnawed at the troops, shaping moods, decisions, and combat effectiveness. Testimonies from German prisoners of war reveal the depth of their shock when first encountering American provisions. One former soldier recalled standing behind barbed wire, eyes wide, as he watched a U.S. infantryman unwrap a chocolate bar, sip instant coffee, and munch on a canned meat sandwich. The sight was almost surreal. Soldiers marching, fighting, and seemingly thriving, while the men who once conquered Europe lived on scraps, acutely aware of every missing calorie. For many Germans, the contrast was more than culinary, it was psychological. The realization that their enemy could not only equip but sustain entire armies in foreign lands was a blow to morale. Where they had endured hunger, fatigue, and cold, Americans appeared vigorous, disciplined, and nourished. Each ration served as proof of a logistical system far superior to anything the Axis could muster, a silent weapon that undercut confidence long before a single bullet was fired. The shortages were not accidental. Allied bombing campaigns had crippled railways, factories, and food depots, making it increasingly difficult to move supplies to the front. Administrative inefficiencies compounded the problem, and as territories were lost, the ability to requisition resources from occupied lands waned. Ersatz substitutes, once tolerable, became the norm, further degrading both nutrition and morale. The German soldier's body weakened as quickly as his spirit, creating a feedback loop of fatigue, desperation, and declining effectiveness on the battlefield. In this climate, small luxuries were unthinkable. Chocolate, once a comfort for civilians and officers alike, had vanished from common rations. The men who survived on thin bread and watery soups could scarcely imagine an enemy soldier carrying sweet treats in his pocket, ready to be eaten mid-battle without a second thought. Every bite of American chocolate, every morsel of well-prepared food, underscored the disparity, a bitter reminder of a war increasingly fought with infrastructure, planning, and foresight rather than sheer force of arms. The Axis shortages would continue to plague their forces through the final years of the war, weakening both body and mind. Yet these deficiencies highlighted a more profound lesson: the power of sustenance, the invisible strength of morale, and the critical role of logistics in modern warfare. And this abundance wasn't luck, it was logistics. Summer 1944. In the heart of Pennsylvania, the hum of machinery filled vast factory halls, a rhythmic symphony of production that echoed the scale of the war itself. Conveyor belts carried row upon row of chocolate bars, canned meat, and powdered milk, while workers, many of them women, moved with precision and urgency. Outside, freight trains waited to carry these goods to ports, where ships would set sail across the Atlantic, navigating U-boat-infested waters to deliver sustenance to soldiers thousands of miles away. The United States had mobilized its food industry with the same intensity and coordination as its weapons factories. Hershey, long known for producing candy for civilians, now operated under military contracts, churning out millions of bars each month. Each bar was carefully wrapped, tested for heat resistance, and packed into crates for shipment. But chocolate was only the beginning. The American war machine relied on a vast ecosystem of suppliers, from canneries producing meat and vegetables to dairy plants generating powdered milk, from bakeries preparing long-lasting hardtack to laboratories creating dehydrated eggs. Every product was engineered to survive transportation, storage, and the extremes of frontline conditions. Ships loaded with food became floating arsenals, as critical as vessels carrying tanks or ammunition. Crossing the Atlantic was perilous. German submarines prowled the waters, intent on cutting supply lines. Yet the sheer volume of production and the meticulous planning behind shipments ensured that, despite attacks and losses, supplies continued to arrive. Soldiers on the front lines rarely went hungry. They received regular, reliable rations that sustained both body and morale. a testament to an industrial system that saw food not as a secondary concern, but as a weapon of war in its own right. The psychological effect of this industrial might was profound. Soldiers knew they could count on a hot meal, a chocolate bar, or a cup of coffee even after exhausting marches or harrowing battles. That knowledge allowed them to push farther, endure longer, and fight with a confidence bolstered by more than training or courage. It was reinforced by the certainty that their nation had invested in their survival. Morale, often fragile on the front lines, became a tangible advantage, reinforced daily by the simple, universal act of eating. Meanwhile, the Axis forces struggled to match this scale. Germany's factories were under constant threat from Allied bombing, and the flow of food and supplies was increasingly erratic. Ersatz substitutes and rationing could not replace the reliability and abundance of the American system. The contrast was stark. Where one army scraped and scavenged, the other thrived on careful planning, industrial capacity, and relentless logistical innovation. Even small touches mattered. Soldiers often wrote home about the chocolate they received, about the comfort of familiar tastes in foreign lands. Packages from civilians, coordinated with military planners, supplemented rations, reinforcing the idea that the soldier was valued, remembered, and sustained not just by calories, but by care. In this way, factories became more than production centers. They were lifelines, psychological anchors and strategic tools, quietly shaping the daily experience of millions of men in uniform. Every crate shipped, every chocolate bar produced, every ration delivered was a cog in a larger machine that determined not only survival, but effectiveness on the battlefield. America's ability to feed its soldiers at scale was as formidable as its ability to deploy tanks, aircraft, and artillery. This wasn't just about feeding soldiers, it was about shaping battle outcomes. Spring, 1945. The streets of liberated French villages shimmered under the soft light of morning. Children peering cautiously from shattered doorways as American soldiers moved through, rifles slung and boots crunching over rubble. Amid the tension and devastation, a small, sweet gesture captured hearts in a way no gunfire could. GIs unwrapped chocolate bars from their packs and offered them to wide-eyed children, their smiles tentative at first, then breaking into laughter as the bitter sweetness met eager tongues. It was a simple act, yet one that carried profound significance. Across Italy, similar scenes unfolded. Soldiers entering bombed towns paused to share candy with villagers, exchanging words through gestures and broken phrases, bridging the vast chasm of language and culture. Chocolate became more than nourishment. It was a token of liberation, a sign that the Americans were not merely conquerors, but protectors, bearers of hope and comfort in a landscape dominated by loss. Each bar handed to a child, each piece shared among neighbors, became a small but powerful emblem of trust and humanity. For German prisoners of war, observing these acts was a revelation. Accustomed to deprivation, witnessing enemy soldiers distribute food freely seemed almost surreal. While the Reich struggled to supply its own soldiers with basic sustenance, Americans could afford not only to feed their troops, but to extend that generosity to civilians and children alike. One former POW later recounted the moment he saw a GI offer chocolate to a French child. It was a mix of admiration, disbelief, and quiet shame. The contrast between abundance and scarcity, between logistical mastery and desperate improvisation, was stark and undeniable. Chocolate at the front lines became a symbol of American values in action. Abundance used wisely, care extended deliberately, and strategy intertwined with humanity. Soldiers themselves understood the power of the gesture. Beyond morale and sustenance, sharing chocolate-forged bonds between strangers, offering comfort in the midst of chaos. It reminded everyone that even in war, civility, kindness, and culture could persist. These small acts echoed far beyond the immediate battlefield, shaping perceptions, softening hearts, and planting the seeds of goodwill in places long scarred by conflict. The distribution of chocolate also reinforced the psychological edge Americans maintained over the Axis. Soldiers felt pride not only in their ability to fight, but in their ability to sustain themselves and others. Every bar was a tangible reminder of a nation that had mastered logistics, production, and foresight, demonstrating superiority not just in firepower, but in care and planning. POWs could only watch, silently registering the implications. A well-fed, motivated, and morally confident army was nearly impossible to defeat. And yet, even as battles raged and towns were liberated, there was a subtle, unspoken promise in every chocolate bar. The war might end, but the lessons of care, planning, and generosity would linger. Soldiers and civilians alike carried these memories with them, small symbols of resilience, ingenuity, and the extraordinary capacity of a nation to support those who fought for freedom. And when the war ended, chocolate would carry an even greater meaning. Summer, 1945. Europe lay in ruins, yet amid the rubble and the lingering smoke of battle, small moments of normalcy began to emerge. Soldiers walked through liberated towns, children ran to greet them, and in the pockets and packs of American GIs, chocolate bars, once tools of survival, had become symbols of something far greater. They were tokens of hope, reminders of home, and proof of a nation's ability to sustain its people and its armies through unimaginable challenges. Chocolate, simple yet profound, had become inseparable from the American war effort. For the soldiers who carried it, it was more than food. It was a lifeline, a morale booster, and a tangible manifestation of industrial ingenuity. Every bar represented hours of planning, innovation, and coordination across factories, warehouses, railways, and ports. The Quartermaster Corps had transformed sustenance into strategy, ensuring that American troops were not only fed, but psychologically fortified to endure the rigors of combat. In every bite there was energy, comfort, and reassurance, a quiet assertion of strength that went far beyond rifles and artillery. For German prisoners of war, chocolate embodied the stark contrast between two nations at war. While the Reich struggled with shortages, ersatz substitutes, and rationing, America had mastered the art of abundance. Every bar, every ration, every thoughtfully prepared meal highlighted the industrial and logistical gulf that had quietly but decisively shaped the outcome of battles. POWs understood, often with a mixture of awe and despair, that this ability to feed and sustain an army was as crucial as tanks, planes, or guns. Chocolate was, in a sense, a weapon, one that America wielded with precision and ingenuity, reshaping morale and endurance in ways the Axis could not match. For civilians in liberated towns, chocolate carried a different yet equally powerful meaning. To children, it was a taste of freedom, a small moment of joy in a landscape dominated by destruction and fear. To adults, it was a reminder that life could return, that normalcy and abundance were possible even after years of occupation and deprivation. Chocolate bridged the gap between survival and celebration, between the battlefield and home, and between strategy and humanity. It was at once sustenance and symbol, nourishment and narrative. The story of chocolate in World War II illustrates a broader truth about the American approach to war. Victory was never just about firepower. It was about preparation, planning, and the foresight to recognize that soldiers were more than fighters. They were human beings whose endurance depended on both body and spirit. Logistics, industry, and care for the individual soldier were quietly decisive factors, shaping outcomes long before battles were fought and victories declared. In this light, the small, unassuming chocolate bar becomes monumental, a testament to the power of foresight, strategy, and humanity. Even decades later, historians and veterans reflect on the lessons of chocolate in the war. It is a reminder that abundance, when thoughtfully applied, can be as transformative as courage, discipline, or strategy. It shows that morale matters, that the human element of war is inseparable from the machinery and firepower. and that victories are often built as much in factories and supply lines as on the front lines. In the end, a simple chocolate bar told a story of abundance, morale, and victory, a sweetness the enemy never expected.